Hello and welcome to line two, the worldly trumps. So, again, we'll be using Rachel Pollack's methodology. And she believed that the first line in tarot was a journey from innocence to experience, or put another way, from childhood to maturity. And so, one of the things that we're going to see, especially with the Empress, is that to Pollock, who believes that the middle parts of this line, right, from the Empress, the Emperor, and the Hierophant are a triad, are a set. We won't go so deep into that because I feel like that's like a very specific philosophy of hers that I don't like. I neither agree nor disagree, right? We can find triads all over tarot if we're looking. But instead of thinking of the Empress as nature, Pollock tended to think of the Empress as reality, and the Emperor and the Hierophant as being anything we impose on top of that reality, right? So that's important to know. So, the Empress's keywords are creation, gestation, growth, anything we have to nurture, anything we have to fertilize, right? Or anything that fertilizes us, like allows us to create better. Expansion, stabilization, and also beautification. So, those are the virtues of the Empress. And the goals of the Empress are to gain in a natural way while avoiding burnout. And I think that this is a very um important way of working, right? I feel like we all know someone who identifies or over identifies with the Empress as an archetype, right? And one of the positive things about that is a lot of times they can accomplish certain things very easily, right? Like things that require a lot of watching and waiting, things that require a hands-off approach, things where you really can overdo it. The Empress is great at. And also, I'm sure we've all been to a garden that's like overrun and not maybe not yielding as much as people may need to feed themselves, right? And so there's a need for some balance with every card, right? And for the Empress, um, we find one of the only tarot cards that comes into a pair, right? So the Empress comes with the Emperor for a reason. And part of that reason is that easeful abundance is wonderful and great, but it also sometimes needs to be turned into something that lasts a little longer than the planting and harvesting of a garden, right? There are times when we do need to save and plan. And that's where the Emperor comes in. But in the meantime, right, the goal of the Empress is to experience joy and pleasure in the physical world and in the body, which we'll talk a lot about in May, and also to live with agency and interdependence. And so the Empress is probably one of our most burnout proof um trumps in all of tarot, right? The Empress is about pleasure and relaxation, about what comes to us naturally. Unfortunately, a lot of us do not get the privilege of living as the archetype of the Empress all the time, for many reasons, right? Capitalism being a major one of them, but also because of people who wealth hoard, right? Empress is one of the cards of wealth in tarot that cannot be overstated, right? There would be no wealth without the Empress, right? And when we think of Empress types, we're often thinking about people who have the luxury of time and wealth. After all, like this is a person who is named as being part of empire, right? So it isn't just that they are sitting easily and avoiding burnout because they have some sort of a superior way of living in the world. They are avoiding burnout because other people are doing their work, right? So when you encounter somebody like this who can look like, oh, you're doing this so easily, it's important to not be so critical on oneself. Like, well, why am I burning out? Like, do you get a throne? Is somebody else doing the work for you, right? Are you just able to be your most abundant self while other people take care of that abundance? If your answer is no, that's part of the reason why burnout is more likely to occur in your position. So, the Emperor, completely different approach, right? So, whatever the Empress creates, the Emperor formalizes, sustains, stabilizes, right? Lords over, maintains, and becomes a model of. So, the Emperor is extremely hegemonic, right? Or leading by example. So, this is a person who can be very my way or the highway. For many of us, our bosses show up as the Emperor, right? Especially if they're competent, right? So if you have a boss that's like technically pretty good at their job, even if their expectations may be unrealistic to you, like you have an understanding that like they've been picked for a reason. There's someone that they're appealing to that's like above you in the in the hierarchy of wherever you work. Um, you can often be like, this person is efficient, regardless of how this is impacting my life. And I think that one of the things about the emperor is what the emperor makes is built to last. So if you're someone who is a boss, right, or if you are at the head of a company or organization, right, it's important to model the emperor in some ways. I'm not going to lie, because even though people don't like the emperor, right, um, if you are the head of something, there's an expectation of being okay at it. Right? Nobody likes working under incompetent leadership. And so the emperor can provide like a really difficult question, right? Because like how does one create non-hierarchical leadership, right? What does leadership mean? What does it look like to be responsible for other people's output, right? Or other people's responsible for other people's labor, right? Or other people's responsibility. And under capitalism, that's a reality, right? Unless you work for yourself. And even if you do work for yourself, right? That's also a complicated place to live under capitalism, right? Because it's like, well, do you own the means of production? Do you just have 1,000 bosses and every client, right? Like that's a completely different question. But like for those of us who work in organizations, right? The burden of competence is the question of the emperor, and also who sets the standards. Because again, this is another card that emperor, empire, it's right there, right? So it's like whose standards are we all being held to? Whose standards decide what's competent and what is not competent, what is enough, what's not enough, who's productive, who isn't productive, right? Whose standards are we following? And how can we subvert those standards? Can we always subvert those standards? Because I feel like when you say, okay, well, tarot and power, tarot and liberation, there's assumption that like we could just be like, oh, well, fuck power, right? But that's an incredibly privileged stance on its own. When I think about I lived collectively for a really long time. And when I think about the people who are best at living collectively, not like in terms of good roommates, but like people who have consistently been able to live collectively, it's usually people who had a fair amount of power underneath society, right? Calling it collective, not like multi-generational households and things like that, but people who are like, I have dropped out of society, not like I'm building resilience against it, right? People who understand themselves to be separate and apart from society, doing something better and different. A lot of times what they're experiencing in addition to like having a good idea is privilege, right? So like for those of us who will have a boss or be a boss, right, for whom those are the two choices, how do we expect more of who we have allowed or haven't even chosen to lead us? In some ways, right, in situations where we do not have a choice whether to work or not, it is important that people hold themselves to the standard of the emperor, in the sense that they are attempting to live by the standards they instill. Not in being a force of empire, right? But like, but they are leading, and they are also following their own rules, right? At their best. It's also important to note that Rachel Pollack, since we are talking about her framework, cites the emperor as the card in tarot of social justice, right? That's because, in large part, it seems, at least from the passage that she wrote, that her understanding of early goddess religions were that you killed the empire, right? And that they ended up fertilizing the soil and that it wasn't supposed to be a permanent emperor. How do I feel about that? It's something that I think it's important for me to tell you. I don't know that I completely agree with her, but I also think it's weird to completely agree with anyone, right? There's no one I completely agree with, or really even completely understand enough about the perspective of anyone to be like, yes, I wholeheartedly agree, because I'm sure there's nothing else under that, right? But that is what she said, and I'm telling you now. And people usually get very upset about it. All right, the emperor's goals: to be an example or a role model, to sustain good things, right? That is something great about the emperor. To practice discernment, right? So to be able to decide, to maintain your agency by being able to make your own decisions, and also this is, I think, a worse part, but also to know where people rank and assign that rank, right? Now the Hierophant. So whatever the Empress creates and the Emperor sustains, the Hierophant routinizes, right? Like what they want is rules. They want routines. They need to extend the life of this through divine or traditional knowledge. So they protect, they entrench, they ordain, right? They initiate, and they also teach and they pass on stories. The Hierophant's goal is to pass on insider knowledge, right? Whether it's your grandma's potato salad recipe or initiation into a religion, or pledging a sorority or fraternity, right? All of these things are the things that the Hierophant does. They want to form private groups and communities. That could be a church, it could be a cult. It can be any number of things, right? To initiate so what cannot be discussed openly, and to ordain and create story, myth, and lore so that traditions can be passed on and understood. Now, the Lovers is the first recipient of this kind of treatment by the Hierophant. And the Lovers is a card of choices, right? It's a card of choices. It's a card of, again, discernment, the discernment that the Hierophant teaches, the Lovers are now asked to enact. And we can see that because of the trees behind them, but we can also see that fate has intervened with the angel. So the goals of the Lovers: communication, balancing, getting along, right? Joining things, saying yes to things, and also collaborating with other people. This is the worldly line. So it actually orients us to the world in which we currently live, right? It orients us into the major players in this story, right? And it also orients us to power and how power works, both our personal power and worldly power, right? Hence the worldly line. So with the Lovers, the goals are to live in harmony, right? To respect the higher power, to at least to consider it, and to make the right choice, often made on signs, right? Not just our pure intuition, but like I don't want to say pure, but our intuition, and also the things that we see around us, the way we believe, our values that we already have, right? These signs can come to us in that way, right? Certain feelings or certain understandings, certain things that people say. So that is the Lovers. And then we move bafflingly, I think, into the Chariot. And so the Chariot is many things, but the Chariot is one of our first cards that really deals with directly the idea of war. The idea of war, conflict, success at any cost, right? And one of the things that I always like, oh, wrong side, that I always like to tell people in my courses, damn, I'm really having I'm trouble pointing to these sphinx, is that these sphinxes come up in Plato's Phaedrus, where they each symbolize a certain direction of the soul, right? So parts of ourselves that are jealous and love war versus parts of ourselves that are fighting to contain our ego, to live a humble life, and to manage conflict, right? And so our question with the Chariot is always which part of ourselves, which part of our spirits will win, right? The part of us that's very ambitious, or the part of us that can be satisfied with our own accomplishments, whether we succeed or fail, right? Et cetera, et cetera. Because one of the things that the Chariot loves to do most is win. um to overcome obstacles. It can often be a card that brings up anger, right? And that anger can be just a little bit farther than a competitive spirit, right? When we're playing sports, this is definitely a card associated with sports and games as well. um we need that passion to get through, right? But it can go too far. Conquering, right? That's what people bought chariots to do. Egotism, and of course, ambition, right? So that's the basics of the Chariot. And the goal of the Chariot is to win, right? To defeat others, to win, control one's own destiny, and also to direct our internal ambition, right? So now that we have understood the choices that we want to make, we understand the laws of our own society that in which we live, we understand which ways of working will be rewarded and which ways will be punished through the information of the Hierophant. We understand that work is necessary as much as in this society, as much as land and food and things like that are now necessary. Whether hopefully we don't like them, since we are in working in this class and in this framework. But regardless of our opinions, right, that is how the rules stand. And that is exactly what Tarot's first line does. It orients us to the way things are, right? And in the next couple of videos, you'll see that tarot takes us beyond what is right now and asks us questions about our own internal transformation and how we achieve enlightenment, right? How we work to change some of the things that we know to be real and true. All right, see you in the next